And if there's no Quran from the 7th century, that means Muhammad had nothing to do with it. And we are destroying Muhammad and the Quran in one fell swoop. Ooh, I love it. Folks, we got to be the first one to introduce it and get it into the public sphere. Because I hope and I really wish, I would like to see Islam destroyed in my lifetime. And I say it on radio, I say this on TV, I say it to all my Muslim friends. Be confident in what you say, and say it passionately, because that will make much more of an impact for a Muslim than if you say timidly or shy or reservedly.
It all begins with Abdul Malik. So who is Abdul Malik? He was the caliph from 685 to 705. He is the one that is known as the great Arab reformer. He takes and creates an identity for Arabs. And what do you do when you try to create an identity for Arabs? Remember, they had already taken over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo, these cities that are all over the Levant. They had now taken over all of North Africa, gone all the way to India in the east and Spain in the west. This they did by the end of the 7th century. But all their traditions were dependent on Judeo-Christian prophets. All their traditions come in the line of Isaac, and they're not from that line. They needed a prophet who comes from Ishmael. So what do? You create a prophet, and you redact it back to the man who started the conquest. And we know that Muhammad is historical. He is the one that begins the conquests. He dies in 632. But if he's a prophet, he has to have a book.
Two folios, 4 pages, dated from 568 to 645. Now, Hatun, when was he born? So he was born in 570. So these are 2 years before Muhammad was born, right? 2 years before Muhammad born, and you have the Quranic folios. You have the Quranic folios.
Jay Smith!
Okay, hold on a minute. Let's continue on. No debate today. You just listen. No debate today. You just listen. So here we go, Hatun. You have now 4 pages of the Quran that are dated 2 years before Muhammad is born. Do these come from Muhammad?
For all of the criticisms that there have been of the Quran and all the speculations there have been regarding the compilation of the Quran within Western scholarship, some which say that the Quran actually began earlier than the Muslims say it began, or some which say that the whole history of it actually went another 200 years after the time of the Prophet Muhammad. None of those are actually grounded in studies of the available manuscripts. As more and more manuscripts have become available, we've been able to confirm with greater and greater accuracy, scientifically, as empirically as one can, that the story that the Muslims have of the compilation of the Quran is, for the most part, accurate. As Karl Ernst has said, it is a better explanation of the data that we have available to us than any other theory that anyone has proposed. The most recent manuscript that was found, and the earliest manuscript of the Quran ever to be found, are the ones that were found in Sana'a, in Yemen, in the old mosque in Sana'a. And there was a lot of speculation when those manuscripts were first found. In fact, there was an article in the Atlantic Monthly about how this was going to tell us new things about the history of the Quran. Well, Nobody had studied them at that point. This was just speculation. Now they've been studied, not all of them, but at least one folio has undergone rigorous analysis. And that rigorous analysis has demonstrated through carbon dating, one, that manuscript does come at about the time when Muslims say the Quran was compiled. But then there's even an underscript of the Quran that's shown, that's on the parchment. What happens is, in the old days, when you used parchment, if you wanted to write something new on it, you didn't throw out the parchment because it was so expensive. You would erase what was on there, and then you would write something new. Now, the inks were also partially metal-based. So, through infrared photography, we can actually get an image of what that Arabic script was that was on that parchment before the Quran as we know it was written on that parchment. That infrared photography has shown us that the surahs as we know them were there and intact. Furthermore, they even show that the slight variations that are in the text are ones that Muslims have attested. There wasn't anything that one could call a variant that Muslims had not attested was a variant of the Quran that had been transmitted by some Muslims. Now, the other thing is, if you think about it, if somebody were to make up a history of the text, you wouldn't have made it up the way that Muslims have the history written down. You would have said, well, it was written at this time, and then it was put down under the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and alhamdulillah, that was that. You wouldn't say, well, first, after he died, they didn't have it written down. Then, under the Caliphate of Abu Bakr, it was written in one form. And then, a few years later, around the year 650, it was put down in another compilation, and this was the final compilation. Nobody would make up that story. So even there, it is really an act of distrust on the part of the Orientalists to try to find different histories, A, than what the Muslims first accounted for, and B, what the manuscripts actually tell us.
And I really wish, I would like to see Islam destroyed in my lifetime. And I say it on radio, I say this on TV, I say it to all my Muslim friends.
Muslims need to be careful when they see these folios that are dated from, look at the dates, 568, so that's 2 years before the birth of Muhammad, up to 645. That is a good 10 years and more after the death of Muhammad. That in and of itself is problematic, because those dates do not correspond with the classical account.
They have this rough dating that they've carbon dated the pages, the parchment that's written on from, I think it's around like 560 to 648 or something to that effect. Which is, by the way, you know, the Prophet's lifetime is about 570 to 632. So, you know, this is not like from the 500s. It's not from the, you know, the 400s. I mean, if you insist that this parchment has to be from the very earliest part of that window, and you insist that the parchment was used right away. So you can imagine, you know, you go to the store and you buy paper. That paper was made, I don't know how long ago, maybe a year ago, maybe 6 months ago. Who knows how long? I mean, I have paper sitting in my office that from 2005, you know, from when I printed my dissertation. So, I mean, the point is that if you insist that this parchment was made in the earlier part of that window, and if you insist that it was made and then immediately used to write the stuff down, then you could say that the Quran comes from before the life of the Prophet. But that's nothing in evidence we have suggests that at all. In fact, I give lots of examples. Sorry, yeah?
The statement he said, radio and the Arab would, whatever.
Use it right away?
And then use it immediately.
No, but just, again, there's no evidence for that. Like, he just says that. I mean, why? Why do you look? What possible evidence do you have for that?
Yeah.
And then the evidence that other people said in defense of him is, oh, why would you leave perfectly good parchment unused? I don't know. Why would I leave perfectly good paper unused in my office for 10 years now? I use paper all the time. I don't know, because people don't use. I mean, this is your kind of early 21st century assumption that people used it immediately is, first of all, not true in the 21st century. Why would it be true in the 7th century? What evidence do we possibly, especially given, and I have an example of this, that people would all the time. We have, for example, the Swiss Articles of Federation, which are supposedly dated. They date themselves to 1291, but the scholars think that they're done written in the 1800s. But the radiocarbon dating of the manuscript, the paper that it's on, it dates in the mid 1200s. So it's between 50 and 100 years. The document is between 50 and 100 years after the production of that paper. And this is just a political document. So my point is that, why should I accept that this was used immediately? You have no evidence for that. You don't even have any evidence. This is like, for example, if you said, in general, Arabs did this because, look, we have all these books of Arabs talking about how they produce parchment and use it, and they have, a study guide and a book on how to deal with paper and books, and we see what we don't have we have no data whatsoever. There's none of that information. So you're just out of the blue saying Arabs used to do this. That's like me saying Arabs used to, scratch their ears with their pinkies. I don't know. I mean, why? I mean, I have no data for that. Why? I could claim anything I want. So, and again, absolutely no evidence. So, if you, in order to, and then what I think is very interesting is that these Quran pages, these Mus'haf pages, first of all, you have verse dividers between the verses, and also dividers between surahs. And it's more drawn in later because you can see that the text is actually wider apart for the surah dividers and where the verse dividers are. So someone can say, oh, someone added those in later. Okay, but the text is written around to have these things in there. And what the crazy thing is that even the Muslim accounts of the Masahif, the copies of the Quran sent out by the Caliph Uthman, they didn't have surah dividers in them. So what you're saying is not only does the Quran predate the Prophet, but even the surah divisions predate the Prophet, and that then later on the Muslims didn't have the surah divisions. So you're basically saying, oh, well, they were so interested in trying to make it look like this book was their new book that they erased the surah divisions that already existed and they pretended that they weren't there, which is absurd. So everything about these Birmingham pages suggests that you have a parchment that's produced between, I think it was 560 and like 640 or something around that. I can't remember the exact dates. And okay, so I have an idea. Maybe there's a parchment that's produced during that time and then is used either during that time or a few years later to write down a copy of the Quran, which would be exactly what the existing consensus of scholars, both Western scholars and Muslim scholars, is. That's exactly what they would say. They'd say, yeah, the Quran is basically composed during the life of the Prophet. It's written down in semi-official form in the years after his death, and it's promulgated officially around 650, which would be exactly what this Birmingham suggests. Is this thing he wrote about the Birmingham Quran pages, which, I think you read the thing I wrote, but I mean, so I don't want to, I guess the people listening can just go read it easier than me summarizing it. But basically, again, is that, he gets on the radio and he makes this really kind of confident claim in a British accent. He just sounds very educated and, very haughty and saying, well, this really undermines, really questions a lot about the origins of Islam, and it suggests that the Quran actually might predate the Prophet Muhammad. And so you're hearing that, and you imagine just a lay person or someone, why should they not believe it? This is a respected scholar saying this. And so what I show is that the number of things you have to believe basically on no evidence in order to hold that position that the Quran comes from before the Prophet Muhammad, the number of things you have to believe are so extreme and so many that it's actually much easier just to say that the Quran comes from the time of the Prophet. I mean, which is not an outrageous claim, right? It's not. I'm not saying the Quran was, came down from heaven in a ball of fire, and there was this golden book that was levitating around or something like that, or it smelled like cheesecake. I'm not making it. I mean, this is just saying this book comes from the life of the Prophet. This was, even if you think he made it up, it was still made up during his, around his lifetime, or was promulgated around 650. So again, I'm not, no metaphysical claims are being made here. And yet that's just not, that's not acceptable to a lot of revisionists. They have to go back and say, no, this can't be true. So the number of things you have to believe in order to accept that the Quran these pages of this Birmingham Mus'haf come from before the Islam are so extreme that basically for me, that's a religious position. If you say his religion is about accepting things based on faith and not on evidence, not on empirical evidence, then that's what Tom Holland is asking you to do. He's asking you to believe something just because you have this unwavering conviction that the Muslims' version of their own religion cannot be true. It has to be made up. And that for me is dogmatic. It's not real scholarship. What's called revisionist school of thought about early Islamic history gets pride of place and prioritized by American and European newspapers and journals and things like that. What does that mean by revisionist? I mean, people who basically, a school of thought which basically says that the generally accepted version of how Islam arose as a religion, and this has nothing to do with whether someone's Muslim or not. I mean, in general, Western scholars basically accept the overall outline for who the Prophet was, when he lived, what he taught. Right? They'll debate the details of certain hadiths, whether this hadith is true or not, things like that. But in general, they say the overall structure of his life is not really questioned. The dating of the Quran is not really questioned. These things have been well established in Western scholarship. But revisionism is a school that really came into being in the late 1970s. But it's gotten kind of beaten down really severely because it constantly gets disproven. For example, one scholar who actually died this last year, just this recently actually, Patricia Krona, a Danish scholar who was working at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies. She had written numerous books. One thing she claimed was that the Hijra dating system didn't start until much later. And then they found a rock inscription in Saudi Arabia dated to the year 13 Hijra in the Caliphate of Omar, and talking about the Caliph Omar and with the year 13 Hijra. So you kept finding evidence that proved the claims of revisionists wrong, and so for example, in the late 1990s, I remember when I was in college, there was this Atlantic Monthly article that had a cover on a picture of the Quran on the cover, and it said, what is the Quran? And it had this magnifying glass slicing through the Quran. It said, scholars are discovering things about the origins of the Quran that are questioning everything about Islam. And it was about these documents that had been found, these very old manuscripts that had been found in Sana'a in Yemen, and saying, there was a German scholar who was saying that, these documents, these pages from early Quran copies are calling into question everything we know about the Quranic text. And then it turned out to be nothing. I mean, when people actually looked at these manuscripts, they were not any different than other mushafs. Some of them were later than people had claimed. And the one that was really early just confirmed actually that not only it was actually a Uthmanic mushaf. What does that mean? It's pages from a mushaf that comes from before the time when Uthman, the Caliph Uthman, promulgated the Quran in around 650. So, and that version, those pages aren't any different they don't have any more differences from the standard version of the Quran than there are differences amongst the various readings of the standard version of the Quran, right? So there's 7 generally not considered canonical readings of the Quran. And this pre-Uthmanic Mus'haf pages, they don't really differ from what the established readings are. So basically, all that was just a bunch of noise, and in the end, it turned out to be nothing. So, but yet these things, you'll always see every year or so, you'll see some newspaper article in the New York Times or something about how someone's uncovered these early Qurans and it's going to shed light on the origins of Islam, and scholars have to tread. Oh, I remember the Atlantic Monthly. It said scholars must tread very carefully. That's what it said on the cover. Because these crazy Muslims, they're gonna overreact, and Lord knows what's going to happen. So it would, this stuff, it really makes me upset because. I don't, as a scholar and as someone, I went to graduate school, I got a PhD at the University of Chicago, and I'm Muslim, and I didn't force my faith on other people, and I didn't require people to accept my beliefs or expect them to consider what I believe to be true without giving them evidence that they accepted, right? So I always had to keep my faith separate from my scholarship. And then you see, people like Tom Holland or other scholars, revisionist scholars, coming and basically, in effect, ignoring evidence, ignoring what has been like the, landslide after landslide of evidence, and instead just insisting on, no, the origins of Islam are different than what everyone says they are. They have to be different. And so what upsets me is what you're saying is you are basically ignoring evidence and you're insisting on a certain perspective, despite the evidence. So how is that any different than what people who are religious are accused of doing? They're accused of ignoring evidence and not being rational and just insisting on their version of history and their faith and their sacred history. So what upsets me is, and especially, of course, it's the revisionists who are the most snide and the most condescending to Muslims.
And I really wish, I would like to see Islam destroyed in my lifetime. And I say it on radio, I say this on TV, I say it to all my Muslim friends. Be confident in what you say, and say it passionately, because that will make much more of an impact for a Muslim than if you say timidly or shy or reservedly.